Rosanna Guadagno, and I'm a social psychologist. And I just want to explain what that means to people who might not know. When you think of a psychologist, you might think therapist or somebody who studies people who suffer from mental disorders. People in my field of psychology, social psychology, that's not us. It doesn't mean that we're outgoing, although we tend to be we tend to polarize one or the other. Social psychologists study typical people, what's typical for people in the world. And I am saying typical rather than normal because I don't really think there is a normal, but in general we talk about averages and how people in general tend to be. And my research in the realm of social psychology has focused on technology, gender, and actually social influence and persuasion. So I'm going to kind of talk about those three topics today in 19 minutes or less. All right, so why is this important? Why do we care about this stuff? Well, I care about this because I've been studying it for the last 20 years. But you look at what's going on in the tech industry right now. If anything, the diversity issues have gotten worse in the last 10 plus years, not better. And this really kind of, in my field, came to a bit of a point when a few weeks back, a Google engineer who had written a 10-page diatribe about why women aren't biologically suited for tech jobs. That became public, and of course there was a huge outcry, and in particular a large response from people in my field, kind of questioning, well, is this really a biological issue? And it's hard to say, but in general the perspective of people in my field who study this believe that it's more of a socialization process. There are biological differences in behavior, but that's not really what's driving women away. That's the big wrapper for my talk, and that's the big wrapper for my research in general. And I'm going to kind of take you from there to discussing kind of one of the main lines of research that I've conducted over the course of my career that kind of get at some of these issues. So these are the things I've looked at. In general, I wanted to study, way back when email was a thing that people thought was a passing fad, I wanted to study whether or not changing the modality from face-to-face to technology mediated interactions, whether or not that would change the interpersonal processes we've seen between people, and in particular between men and women. Now this may seem like a silly question to ask now because all of us have played around with social media and email and texting for the last 20 years, but back in the beginning we just didn't know. And so that was the first thing I wanted to look at. And then the other question was, well, the gender in tech has always been an issue for as long as I can remember. So I also want to look at whether or not men and women responded to technology and interacting with individuals over technology differently. And so that's what I basically spent the bulk of my career studying. And unfortunately, with so many complex social things, the answer to this question really is, it depends. Sometimes men and women respond quite similarly to social stimuli, and sometimes they don't. And when technology comes into play, the gender differences tend to be a little bit more magnified than what we see in other areas of human behavior. All right, so I'm going to give you some kind of working definitions. So as I said, one of the things I study primarily, in addition to gender and technology, is social influence and persuasion. So how do we get people to change their attitudes and behavior? And this has become a bigger issue, especially more recently, as Pierre mentioned, with the fake news, because a lot of what happens with fake news is it's our friends and the people in our environment spreading false information that's convincing us that it's okay. So how do I define social influence? And this is the standard definition in our field. It has to do with a change in our thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, or behavior as a function of real or imagined external pressure. So if other people think we ought to change our attitude, sometimes we do. Other people think we ought to change our behavior, sometimes we do. And that phenomenon is much greater when more people in our social lives have the same opinion. So we're much more likely to shift when the group tells us to do so. And that has implications for social media. In general, we look at two different types of social influence: compliance, which is getting people to change their behavior, and persuasion, which is getting people to change their attitudes. And in this research, I'm looking at attitude change. In general, I've looked at both behavior and attitude change. And the mechanisms are different, which is why I made the difference. And then I like cartoons, and this is an ineffective tool of persuasion. If you're a mobster and you want somebody to pay you the money you owe them, you don't bring a whippable bat. You just don't, because as you can see, it's not working. So it says, see if still a man wanting to see, let's see if Rudy and his wiffle bat can help encourage you. All right, so that's persuasion. Let's talk a bit about gender. So this goes to this question of the nature versus nurture of gender differences. This is social role theory, and This is the prevalent theory of gender differences in behavior accepted in my field. And in fact, one of the best responses to that in Google Engineer's 10-page diatribe against women was written by the main proponent of this theory. Her name is Alice Eagley. And her theory, and it's not just her, she's got collaborators and colleagues as well, that gets to this question of why do we see these sex differences in social behavior? Well, they come from two different places. What we expect from men and women as a function of whether or not we identify them as male or female, and the beliefs we have about their skills and abilities as a function of whether or not they're male and female. So, just a thought experiment here. If you think about an engineer, how many of you guys think of a woman? We don't expect women to be engineers. We don't believe that women's personalities are consistent with what the personality traits that are associated with engineers. And that's a huge part of the problem. In general, these different expectations and beliefs come from what's been a traditional division of labor between the sexes. So historically, if you look at human society, it's largely been the men as the hunters, the women as gatherers, and so researchers in this field think that that's kind of where these beliefs and expectations about men and women came from. Now, the impact of those things is that we expect men to have more agency, to be independent, to be task-focused, to be competitive. And those are a lot of characteristics that kind of fit what you might expect people who are successful in the business world to be. Whereas women are inferred, we infer that women are more communal, are more social, relational oriented, that they're more into relationships and communal bonding and social bonds. And so we associate them more with being touchy-feely, with being kind to the children, and so on and so forth. And there are costs if you're a woman and you don't match those communal expectations. There are social costs. We get judged differently. It affects pay, it affects all sorts of outcomes. With men in general, there are also costs as well for not matching these characteristics, but in general, what tends to happen with men is that when they don't meet those characteristics, they get promoted. So for instance, the proverbial male nurse, that you see sitcoms make fun of, what happens in the real hospital situations is male nurses are almost always mistaken for doctors, whereas female doctors are almost always mistaken for nurses, and there's lots of data on that. So, this question of, are these gender differences biological? Well, sure, we have hormonal differences in between men and women in terms of the sex hormones, testosterone versus estrogen. But realistically, it starts at the beginning. There are studies that have taken a baby and randomly assigned it to have half the people who meet it think it's a boy, and half the people think it's a girl. And when they think it's a boy, they say, oh, he's so strong. And when the baby grabs the finger, oh, he's got such a tight grip. But when they think that same exact baby is a girl, they say, oh, isn't she so pretty? Isn't she so dainty? I love her little fingers. Totally different explanation, but it's the same baby. So much of who people are as men or women and their gender identity is constructed by our society. And that has implications for the careers we choose, as well as all sorts of other outcomes. Now, most of my research has looked at these issues with respect to technology use, so let me tell you a little bit about what I found there. Actually, I need to look at that one instead, because if I walk that way, I get it. It's bigger there. Okay, so what I found is that men tend to be more agentic in the way that they use technology. So in some of our research, we've looked at how men and women use social media. Women use social media to maintain existing relationships, in general, on average, more than men do. Whereas men use social media to find job opportunities, to find people they want to date, and to make new friends. And so they're being independent, they're being more assertive, and they're being more explorative in their social media use. We found as well that men tend to be more task-focused when using forms of technology to communicate, whereas, again, women are socializing more. And we've also found that even when people have the opportunity to do so, they choose to behave in a manner consistent with gender roles. This is actually one of my favorite studies I've done over the years. We had a data set of educators, and they were just talking about Second Life, the virtual world, which was popular back then, not so much anymore. And it was a survey, a secondary data set where we just had them talk about their experiences in Second Life. And what my lab did is we coded in terms of gender roles. And what we found is that the women were shopping and dressing their avatar and making friends and going to concerts. And the men were building, buying, and playing around with all sorts of different bodies and basically engaging in all these agentic things. So we see communal and agentic behavior in a virtual environment where you're free to be anything and anyone. It's sometimes hard for us, I think, to break out of these socialized roles. Now, the other thing we know about technology-mediated interactions is that they're not always as nice or as friendly as face-to-face interactions. And so what we found in general is that it's harder to tell what people mean when communicating through text. It's harder to resolve disagreements, and I don't know about you guys, but I saw this all the time playing out during the election season on my social media pages. And in general, group norms are more influential, which, so if you think about this, if you think that all your friends in social media have a certain set of belief, it's more likely to shift your belief to match theirs. So social media is pretty powerful in both bringing out certain behaviors that maybe aren't the best for our society, but it's also very good at convincing us that most of our friends believe the same thing. Now, I've studied this, I've studied many things, and I just gave you guys quick bullet points on some of the research I've done previously. I want to talk more in detail about some research I've done, and this is kind of my core research that's looked at gender and technology and persuasion. So I've looked at this, these are just the same research questions I raised earlier. So does it matter if we have a persuasion attempt over email or face-to-face? Does it matter if it's men or women trying to convince the other person? And I've spent a lot of the last 20 years examining this issue. So this is just a simple research design. And what I did in all of these studies, and we had different variations of them, but initially what we've done is have a person who's part of my research team pretend to be a research participant and try to convince an actual research participant that comprehensive exams as a new graduation requirement is a good idea. Now, your typical college student doesn't like exams. I can tell you that. I've been teaching them for 20 years. They hate exams. The idea of having to take an exam to get their bachelor's degree, they really, really hate it. And so this is a topic that we use often when trying to convince people, often because I sample from college students in general with my research. So what we thought, based on kind of putting together all this research on social roles and on what we know about technology, so we thought, okay, technology and interactions over technology maybe are just a little bit more agentic and a little bit more task-focused and maybe more consistent with the male gender role. So we thought that with men, they wouldn't necessarily show a difference in persuasion between the two different types of communication. For women, we thought that having the email and a lessened ability to convey your meaning, to convey social cues and friendliness and whatnot, might interrupt the communal process and interrupt women's ability to form communal bonds. And we thought in that case it might make them less likely to be persuaded. So we expected women who had a persuasion attempt occur over email would be less likely to be persuaded than men. So that was what we studied. And we did this in this really convoluted way. And I'm just going to walk you through it real fast. So we have a real research participant and a Confederate show up at a lab. The real research participant thinks they're both there for the study. We separate them. We tell them that they're here to, yeah, there's my lab room, to be, we tell the participant that they were randomly assigned to be a reviewer. In social psychology research, nobody's really randomly assigned to be anything because we're a little bit of puppeteers to study social interaction. Then we just gave them some preparation about what this comprehensive exam idea was. And then this is one of the background materials from one of my previous universities where we ran the study. And it just described it as similar to the SAT, except there's also a subject exam. So whatever you're getting your degree in, you have to take and pass that too. So again, like I said, they hated it. And then we had them discuss it with the Confederate or the member of my research team over email or face-to-face. And the member of my research team had a preset series of persuasive arguments as to why the comprehensive exams were a good idea. And they expressed these during the interaction. And then this is a picture of we designed that messaging program That was from my dissertation study, to look like Outlook, which was big during the particular time around us. We've had different iterations of these, and you probably recognize that. My husband's in the audience. He wrote that for me. All right, so then after the interaction, and those are models, by the way, not my real Confederates. And then this is an example of some of the interactions. So the participant might ask them a question like, how do you like it here? And the Confederate says, well, I like it, but it could be improved. That's why I'm in favor of the exams. I remember this article, they said they read an article on exams. I remember the article saying the quality of undergraduate teaching is better at schools with exams. And so in general, these are some well-reasoned arguments for why the exams are a good idea. Another one is, have you ever talked to anyone from a school that requires exams? And he said, no, not really, but my professor in the ed class that I took last semester said that grad schools give preferences to schools that have comprehensive exams. So again, another good reason. And then after that was over, we measured their persuasion and whether or not they thought that these comprehensive exams were a good idea. And then we told them the truth about what we were doing and why we were doing it, and then let them go on their merry way. All right, so that was what we did with the study. I know that was really fast, and I've got 3 minutes and 40 seconds left. Any quick questions, or did the method make sense to you guys? Are we good? All right, excellent. Results, persuasion. This is pretty much exactly what we expected. For the men, it looks like the difference is significant, but it's not. And across the 8 studies I've run, we've never found a significant difference between communication mode for men. Sometimes the means flip one way or the other, but this difference is never significant. But this one always is. So yes, not only were women less persuaded in email than face-to-face, they also liked the Confederate less than in any other condition, even though I randomly assigned my Confederate so that I had the same people across the conditions trying to persuade. So we found that women were less open to persuasion over email than face-to-face, or compared to men in face-to-face as well. So they just resisted the message. So then we wanted to figure out, okay, well, does this have to do with social roles? What's going on here? So the other thing we looked at was how much conversation they had outside of the persuasive script that we established. And so we looked at how much they went off script. And here's the men, here's the women. And what we found is 2 things. First off, in general, men versus women, men were the chatty Cathys, which was a big surprise to me because the stereotype, of course, is that women are the chatty ones, which is why they're chatty Cathys instead of chatty Carls. In fact, more recently, a study in Science has come out that says that, yeah, guys, you are the chatty Carls. Men, on average, on a daily basis, talk more than women do, despite the stereotype. But this was before the Science article. When we looked at what they were saying when they went off script, for men, it was all about competition and dominance. What fraternity are you in? I'm VP of my frat. That's what one of our participants said to a Confederate. Another one was like, do you mountain bike? I mountain bike. I'm the president of my mountain biking club. And it was clear that they were very uncomfortable being in a context where the other person knew more about the topic than they did, and so they were trying to equalize the status. Whereas the women, their conversations when they went off topic were completely different, totally communal. Which psych class are you in? Do you have the same professor I do? Are you in a sorority? Maybe you should come rush mine. And I spent like a whole summer listening to all of these, and it was just amazing to me just the ways that social role theory just played out in these conversations. All right, I'm running to the end. We've run this many, many, many times, and I can talk to you guys at the break of what we found. But in general, what we find is that technology seems to disrupt women's socialized desire for communal bonding. Doesn't mean that, and hang on. Oh yeah. So we've looked at it with avatars, and we found that men and women respond to male and female avatars the same way they do male and female humans, which I thought was fascinating. So yeah, you can use avatars as long as it matches on gender of the interactant. They can be just as compelling as people in face-to-face. We looked at competitive and cooperative prior interactions. Getting men to compete and then trying to persuade them is the one thing that will drive their persuasion down. Whereas for women, any sort of prior interaction that occurs face-to-face before an email interaction makes the effect go away. So giving women an opportunity to bond makes the finding go away. Whereas for men, the nature of the interaction matters. And I see that I'm out of time, so I will leave it at that, and I would be happy to discuss, oops, I went too far. Sorry, I meant to say thank you and give you my contact information. There you go, right up there. And if you, and I skipped the kind of the upshot, but I'd be happy to discuss that during the break. Thank you, and I'd be happy to have any questions.